There was a built-up path through the flooded fields, but it was submerged to ankle depth, with occasional thigh-high slippages. Only the raised canal drains stood well above the brackish water, and they all ran towards the east, not towards the village, so Sabriel and Touchstone were forced to wade along the path. Mogget, of course, rode, his lean form draped around Sabriel's neck like a white fox fur. Water and mud, coupled with an uncertain path, made it slow going. It took an hour to cover less than a mile, so it was later in the afternoon than Sabriel would have wished when they finally climbed out of the water, up onto the beginnings of the village's rocky mount. At least the sky is clear, Sabriel thought, glancing up. The winter sun wasn't particularly hot, and couldn't be described as glaring, but it would certainly deter most kindred of the lesser dead from venturing out. Nevertheless, they walked carefully up to the village, swords loose, Sabriel with a hand to her bells. The path wound up in a series of steps carved from the rock, reinforced here and there with bricks and mortar. The village proper nestled on top of the bluff, about 30 cozy brick cottages, with wood tile roofs, some painted bright colors, some dull, and some simply gray and weather-beaten. It was completely silent, save for the odd gust of wind or the mournful cry of a gull slipping down through the air above. Sabriel and Touchstone drew closer together, walking almost shoulder to shoulder up what passed for a main street, swords out now, eyes flickering across closed doors and shuttered windows. Both felt uneasy, nervous, a nasty, tingling, creeping sensation climbing up from spine to nape of neck to forehead charter mark. Sabriel also felt the presence of dead things, lesser dead, hiding from sunlight, lurking somewhere nearby in a house or cellar. At the end of the main street, on the highest point of the bluff, a charter stone stood on a patch of carefully tended lawn. Half of the stone had been sheared away, pieces broken and tumbled, dark stone on green turf. A body lay in front of the stone, hands and feet bound, the gaping cut across the throat a clear sign of where the blood had come from. The blood for the sacrifice that broke the stone. Sabriel knelt by the corpse, eyes averted from the broken stone. It was only recently ruined, she felt, but already the door to death was creaking open. She could almost feel the cold of the current beyond, leaking out around the stone, sucking warmth and life from the air. Things lurked there too, she knew, just beyond the border. She sensed their hunger for life, their impatience for night to fall. As she'd expected, the corpse was of a charter mage, dead but 3 or 4 days. But she hadn't expected to find the dead person was a woman. Wide shoulders and a muscular build had deceived her for a moment, but there was a middle-aged woman before her, eyes shut, throat cut, short brown hair caked with sea salt and blood. "The village healer," said Mogget, indicating a bracelet on her wrist with his nose. Sabriel pushed the rope bindings aside for a better look. The bracelet was bronze, with inlaid charter marks of greenstone, dead marks now, for blood dried upon the bronze, and no pulse beat in the skin under the metal. "She was killed 3 or 4 days ago," Sabriel announced. "The stone was broken at the same time." Touchstone looked back at her and nodded grimly, then resumed, watching the houses opposite. His swords hung loosely in his hands, but Sabriel noted that his entire body was tense, like a compressed jack-in-the-box, ready to spring. "Whoever, whatever, killed her and broke the stone didn't enslave her spirit," Sabriel added quietly, as if thinking to herself. "I wonder why." Neither Mogget nor Touchstone answered. For a moment, Sabriel considered asking the woman herself, but her impetuous desire for journeys into death had been soundly dampened by recent experience. Instead, she cut the woman's bonds and arranged her as best she could, ending up with a sort of curled-up sleeping position. "I don't know your name, healer," Sabriel whispered, "but I hope you go quickly beyond the final gate. Farewell." She stood back and drew the charter marks for the funeral pyre above the corpse, whispering the names of the marks as she did so, but her fingers fumbled and words went awry. The baleful influence of the broken stone pressed against her like a wrestler gripping her wrists, clamping her jaw. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and pain shot through her limbs, her hands shaking with effort, tongue clumsy, seeming swollen in her suddenly dry mouth. Then she felt the assistance come, strength flowing through her, reinforcing the marks, steadying her hands, clearing her voice. She completed the litany, and a spark exploded above the woman, became a twisting flame, then grew to a fierce white-hot blaze that spread the length of the woman's body, totally consuming it to leave only ash, light cargo for the winds. The extra strength came from Touchstone's hand, his open palm lightly resting on her shoulder. As she straightened up, the touch was lost. When Sabriel turned around, Touchstone was just drawing his right-hand sword, eyes fixed on the houses, as if he'd had nothing to do with helping her. "Thank you," said Sabriel. Touchstone was a strong charter mage, perhaps as strong as she was. This surprised her, though she couldn't think why. He'd made no secret of being a charter mage. She'd just assumed he would only know a few of the more fighting-related marks and spells, petty magics. "We should move on," said Mogget, prowling backwards and forwards in agitation, carefully avoiding the fragments from the broken stone. "Find a boat and put to sea before nightfall." "The harbor is that way," Touchstone added quickly, pointing with his sword. Both he and the cat seemed very keen to leave the area around the broken stone, thought Sabriel. But then, so was she. Even in bright daylight, it seemed to dull the color around it. The lawn was already more yellow than green, and even the shadows looked thicker and more abundant than they should. She shivered, remembering Cloven Crest and a thing called Throg. The harbor lay on the northern side of the bluff, reached by another series of steps in the rocky hill, or in the case of the cargo, via one of the sheer-legged hoists that lined the edge of the bluff. Long wooden jetties thrust out into the clear, blue-green water, sheltered under the lee of a rocky island, a smaller sibling of the village bluff. A long breakwater of huge boulders joined island and shore, completing the harbor's protection from wind and wave. There were no boats moored in the harbor, tied up to the jetties or at the harbor wall. Not even a dinghy, hauled up for repair. Sabriel stood on the steps, looking down, mind temporarily devoid of further plans. She just watched the swirl of the sea around the barnacled piles of the jetties, the moving shadows in the blue, marking small fish schooling about their business. Mogget sat near her feet, sniffing the air, silent. Touchstone stood higher, behind her, guarding the rear. "What now?" asked Sabriel, generally indicating the empty harbor below, her arm moving with the same rhythm as the swell, in his perpetual tilt against wooden stone. "There are people on the island," Mogget said, eyes slitted against the wind, "and boats tied up between the two outcrops of rock on the southwest." Sabriel looked, but saw nothing, till she extracted the telescope from the pack on Touchstone's back. He stood completely still while she ferreted about, silent as the empty village. Playing wooden again, Sabriel thought, but she didn't really mind. He was being helpful, without metaphorically tugging his forelock every few minutes. Through the telescope, she saw that Mogget was right. There were several boats partly hidden between two spurs of rock, and some slight signs of habitation, a glimpse of a washing line blown around the corner of a tall rock. The momentary sight of movement between two of the 6 or 7 ramshackle buildings that nestled on the island's southwestern side. Shifting her gaze to the breakwater, Sabriel followed its length. As she'd half expected, there was a gap in the very middle of it, where the sea rushed through with considerable force. A pile of timber on the island side of the breakwater indicated there had once been a bridge there, now removed. "It looks like the villagers fled to the island," she said, shutting the telescope down. "There's a gap in the breakwater to keep running water between the island and shore, an ideal defense against the dead. I don't think even a Mordicant would risk crossing deep tidal water. Let's go, then," muttered Touchstone. He'd sounded nervous again, jumpy. Sabriel looked at him, then above his head, and saw why he was nervous. Clouds were rolling in from the southeast, behind the village, dark clouds, laden with rain. The air was calm, but now she saw the clouds. Sabriel recognized it was the calm before heavy rain. The sun would not be guarding them for very much longer, and night would be an early guest. Without further urging, she set off down the steps, down to the harbor side, then along to the breakwater. Touchstone followed more slowly, turning every few steps to watch the rear. Mogget did likewise, his small cat face continually looking back, peering up at the houses. Behind them, shutters inched open and fleshless eyes watched from the safety of the shadows, watched the trio marching out to the breakwater, still washed in harsh sunlight, flanked by swift-moving waves of terrible water. Rotten, corroded teeth ground and gnashed in skeletal mouths. Farther back from the windows, shadows darker than ones ever cast by light whirled in frustration, anger, and fear. They all knew who had passed. One such shadow, selected by lot and compelled by its peers, gave up its existence in life with a silent scream, vanishing into death. Their master was many, many leagues away, and the quickest way to reach him lay in death. Of course, message delivered, the messenger would fall through the gates to a final demise, but the master didn't care about that. The gap in the breakwater proved to be at least 15 feet wide, and the water was twice Sabriel's height, the sea surging through with a rough aggression. It was also covered by archers from the island, as they discovered when an arrow struck the stones in front of them and skittered off into the sea. Instantly, Touchstone rushed in front of Sabriel, and she felt the flow of charter magic from him, his sword sketching a great circle in the air in front of them both. Glowing lines followed the sword's path till a shining circle hung in the air. 4 arrows curved through the air from the island. One, striking the circle, simply vanished. The other 3 missed completely, striking stones or sea. "Arrow ward," gasped Touchstone. "Effective, but hard to keep going. Do we retreat?" "Not yet," replied Sabriel. She could feel the dead stirring in the village behind them, and she could also see the archers now. There were 4 of them, 2 pairs, each behind one of the large, upthrust stones that marked where the breakwater joined the island. They looked young, nervous, and were already proven to be of little threat. "Hold!" shouted Sabriel. "We're friends!" There was no reply, but the archers didn't loose their nocked arrows. "What's the village leader's title? Usually, I mean. What are they called?" Sabriel whispered hurriedly to Touchstone, once again wishing she knew more about the old kingdom and its customs. "In my day," Touchstone replied slowly, his swords retracing the arrow ward, attention mostly on that. "In my day, elder for this size of village." "We wish to speak with your elder," shouted Sabriel. She pointed at the cloud front advancing behind her, and added, "Before darkness falls." "Wait!" came the answer, and one of the archers scampered back from the rocks, up towards the buildings. Closer to, Sabriel realized they were probably boathouses or something like that. The archer returned in a few minutes, an older man hobbling over the rocks behind him. The other 3 archers, seeing him, lowered their bows and returned shafts to quivers. Touchstone, seeing this, ceased to maintain the arrow ward. It hung in the air for a moment, then dissipated, leaving a momentary rainbow. The elder was named, in fact, as well as title, they saw, as he limped along the breakwater. Long white hair blew like fragile cobwebs around his thin, wrinkled face, and he moved with the deliberate intention of the very old. He seemed unafraid, perhaps possessed of the disinterested courage of one already close to death. "Who are you?" he asked, when he reached the gap, standing above the swirling waters like some prophet of legend, his deep orange cloak flapping around him from the rising breeze. "What do you want?" Sabriel opened her mouth to answer, but Touchstone had already started to speak, loudly. "I am Touchstone, sworn swordsman for the Aborson, who stands before you. Are arrows your welcome for such folk as we?" The old man was silent for a moment, his deep-set eyes focused on Sabriel, as if he could strip away any falsity or illusion by sight alone. Sabriel met his gaze, but out of the corner of her mouth she whispered to Touchstone, "What makes you think you can speak for me? Wouldn't a friendly approach be better? And since when are you my sworn—" She stopped, as the old man cleared his throat to speak and spat into the water. For a moment, she thought that this was his response, but as neither the archers nor Touchstone reacted, it was obviously of no account. "These are bad times," the elder said. "We have been forced to leave our firesides for the smoking sheds, warmth and comfort for sea winds and a stench of fish. Many of the people of Nestowe are dead, or worse. Strangers and travelers are rare in such times, and not always what they seem." I am the Aborson, Sabriel said reluctantly. Enemy of the dead.
I remember, replied the old man slowly. Aborson came here when I was a young man. He came to put down the haunts that the spice merchant bought. Charter curse him. Aborson. I remember that coat you're wearing, blue as a 10-fathom sea, with the silver keys. There was a sword also. He paused expectantly. Sabriel stood silently, waiting for him to go on. He wants to see the sword, Touchstone said, voice flat, after the silence stretched too far. Oh, replied Sabriel, flushing. It was quite obvious. Carefully, so as not to alarm the archers, she drew her sword, holding it up to the sun so the charter marks could be clearly seen, silver dancers on the blade. Yes, sighed the elder, old shoulders sagging with relief. That is the sword. Charter spelled. She is the Aborson. He turned and tottered back towards the archers, worn voice increasing to the ghost of a fisherman's crosswater hail. Come on, you four! Quick with the bridge! We have visitors! Help at last! Sabriel glanced at Touchstone, raising her eyebrows at the implication of the old man's last 3 words. Surprisingly, Touchstone met her gaze and held it. It is traditional for someone of high rank, such as yourself, to be announced by their sworn swordsman, he said quietly. And the only acceptable way for me to travel with you is as your sworn swordsman. Otherwise, people will assume that we are, at best, illicit lovers. Having your name coupled to mine in such a guise would lower you in most eyes. You see? Ah, replied Sabriel, gulping, feeling the flush of embarrassment come back and spread from her cheeks to her neck. It felt a lot like being on the receiving end of one of Miss Preont's severest social put-downs. She hadn't even thought about how it would look, the two of them traveling together. Certainly, in Ancestiere, it would be considered shameful, but this was the Old Kingdom, where things were different. But only some things, it seemed. Lesson 207, muttered Mogget from somewhere near her feet. 3 out of 10. I wonder if they've got any fresh caught whiting. I'd like a small one, still flopping. Be quiet, Sabriel interrupted. You'd better pretend to be a normal cat for a while. Very well, milady, Aborson, Mogget replied, stalking away to sit on the other side of Touchstone. Sabriel was about to reply scathingly when she saw the faintest curve at the corner of Touchstone's mouth. Touchstone, grinning. Surprised, she misplaced her retort on her tongue, then forgot it altogether, as the 4 archers heaved a plank across the gap, the end smacking down onto stone with a startling bang. Please cross quickly, the elder said, as the men steadied the plank. There are many fell creatures in the village now, and I fear the day is almost done. True to his words, cloud shadow fell across them as he spoke, and the fresh scent of closing rain mingled with the wet and salty smell of the sea. Without further urging, Sabriel ran quickly across the plank, Mogget behind her, Touchstone bringing up the rear.